So now at this point, with chapter 2, part 2, we are going to continue with our conversation about the theories, or the three basic or most important theories, if you will, in sociology. So we close with the conversation about Emil Durkheim and how he likened society to a living organism. And now I want to introduce you to another scholar who was influenced by Emil Durkheim and the functionalist theory. So Robert Merton, and we'll find this throughout the semester, that there are other scholars who will then add to the theoretical perspectives that the early founders created. Right, and so Robert Merton was influenced by Emil Durkheim and added to our understanding of functionalism as a theory. So for Merton, what he did was create a definition for functions. And he says that functions are the beneficial consequences of people's actions. So an example would be parents going to work to support their children, right? Parents going to work is the action, and the consequence of that is that they're better able to support their children. That is an example of a function. Merton goes on then to describe the types of functions that social institutions have. The first is manifest function. This is these functions are intended to help some part of the system. So here's an example. Your textbook uses a similar or the same example. Imagine, if you will, a particular nation is experiencing depopulation, and it wants to figure out a way in order to encourage its families, its citizens to have children. The government decides to offer a $10,000 bonus to every family who has a child in a particular year. The manifest function, right, the intention is that the government wants to see an increase in its population. When that happens, that is a manifest function. That was the intended consequence. If we build onto that, what then happens when individuals who get the $10,000 for having another child then need to go and buy diapers and formula and other things for their babies? What then would happen would be a boom, if you will, in the baby industry, right? The diaper industry would experience a boom because now you have more people going out to buy goods and services needed to raise an infant. So the boom in the economy, or the fact that these businesses now have increased revenue, is what Merton would refer to as a latent function, an unintended consequence that still helps some part of the system. And so with this, while the government's initial intent, what they wanted to see was an increase in its population, that's the manifest function, something they weren't expecting or didn't necessarily require, right? The boom in the economy, that is a latent function, right? That happened later, yet it was also still beneficial to the functioning of the social institutions. And so here's a visual as a way to help us think about social structural functionalism, or just functionalist theory. Society as the center. It is representative of a living organism, and that all these different institutions are working together to keep society functioning. So another key aspect of theory is trying to apply it, right? Using theory to help us understand various phenomena. So that's what we're going to do here. For whatever reason, our author of our textbook uses marriage and divorce as his examples, and so we're going to continue along that line. So right now we're going to think of as if we were functionalists, and we're going to pose the question: what about divorce? Why perhaps is divorce more prevalent than it was 50 years ago or so? If we're thinking like a functionalist, we're going to focus, right, on the social institutions. We're going to look at how those institutions may have changed, right, and what led to those changes. So, for a functionalist might stress that industrialization weakened traditional family functions, right? As you have the move from rural to urban, the needs of the families changed. The roles of women and children and their reliance upon one another change. This is the functionalist point of view. And in that, the family share fewer functions, and the ties that bind were weakened. The functionalist perspective, again, if we're looking and we're asking the question, why did divorce begin to increase, or rates of divorce begin to increase? Functionalists would also say that many of the functions that bound traditional families together changed or ended. So again, when we're using a functionalist perspective, we're looking at what changes occurred within the institution, what either weakened or strengthened them in particular, right? And how did those changes in the institutions of family, religion, economy, education, or government, how then that caused shifts in society overall? Okay, moving on. Let's talk about conflict theory. Right, so conflict theory introduced by Karl Marx, one of our canonical thinkers, right, one of the founders, if you will, of sociological thought. Karl Marx is responsible for giving sociology conflict theory. Conflict theory is a macro level approach which allows us to look at large scale phenomena like globalization or world poverty or war and things of that nature. And so for Karl Marx, he said that society is viewed as composed of groups that are competing for scarce resources. He said that the idea that conflict between competing interests is the basic animating force of social change and society in general. Right, so to be clear, Karl Marx pointed to capitalism as the reason for increased conflict between social groups. He argued that the key to human history is class conflict. And then he very clearly outlined and gave names, if you will, to two groups in particular. First, if you were to think about society as a triangle, at the very top of the triangle would be what Marx referred to as the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois, right? That is a small group of capitalists who own the means of production. Those individuals who were able to have the capital to invest and build the infrastructure necessary for factories, and then the machines that needed to go into the factories, and then the people who are going to work in the factories and the ability to pay them. That would be, or those people would make up the bourgeoisie. Marx described the masses of workers who worked under or for the bourgeoisie as the proletariat. For Marx, these two groups, in his envisioning, are central to understanding conflict. For Marx, his idea was that if at some point the proletariat, right, the masses of the workers, would experience what he called class consciousness, that they would recognize their exploitation or that they were being exploited for their labor, not being paid fair and equal wages, that they weren't given equal access to all the resources, right, that their basic needs were not being provided for, and that would lead to a full-scale revolution. The proletariat would then work to dismantle the structure or the system and choose to create a society in which things were far more egalitarian, where individuals will have the opportunity to have fair and equitable access to resources, right? So a society in which people would have access to their basic needs or have their basic needs provided for. What we should also note, though, is that while Marx and conflict theory, or Marx's introduction of conflict theory focused on the economy, that many sociologists and other scholars use conflict theory and the basic tenets of the theory to examine conflicts that exist outside of the economy, right? So you can use conflict theory to look at conflict between any opposing groups, right? Between men and women, between groups based on race and ethnicity or sexuality, or the relationship that might exist between workers and management or workers and employers. So here again, the same thing that we did with functionalism, we're now going to do with conflict theory, right? If we're using a conflict theoretical approach, and we're going to examine marriage and divorce again, because that's what our text does, we're going to ask the question, very similar to our last question, Why is the U.S. divorce rate so high? Using the conflict perspective, we're going to look at what kind of opposition, right, or what opposing forces are at play. In this case, when we initially think of marriage and divorce, right, we think about the two spouses or the partners involved. Right. And so here, a conflict theorist might look at it by asking the question or stating societal changes brought women the ability to meet their basic survival needs without being dependent on a husband. We might also explain the U.S. divorce rate by saying that women have new power to refuse to bear burdens that earlier generations accepted as inevitable. So as you see in this case, conflict theorists oftentimes look at power dynamics, right? And what shifts occur over time that may change power dynamics. So if you recall from chapter 1, when we looked at or briefly discussed World War II and how the war efforts changed the relationships between husbands and wives when men were off at war. Women then entered into the labor force in order to support the war effort. They then were able to make their own money, and then were able to provide for themselves and their families. This then changed gender dynamics when husbands returned home from the war, right? And women had now participation not only in the domestic sphere, like in their homes, but also at work, and their ability to now make and provide for their families just like their husbands had been. So again, here we'd be looking at the power dynamics, right? The tug and pull of opposition, right? The tug and pull between a husband and wife. Our third and final theoretical perspective for now is symbolic interactionism. Unlike our first two theories of functionalism and conflict theory, symbolic interactionism is a micro level perspective. And what this means is this is where we look at our intimate day-to-day experiences, right? Our face-to-face interactions. One of the theorists that we will highlight is George Herbert Mead. Central to the theory of symbolic interactionism is the study of language. Symbolic interactionists pay particular attention to language, what is both said, right, or what is both spoken and unspoken, right, the symbols that we use in our everyday lives. Symbolic interactionists argue that symbolic thought frees us from our limited experiences. They also assert that all interactions involve an exchange of symbols and that we look for clues to interpret others' behaviors. To stress this point further, consider this. Symbols play a role in all of our lives, and dependent upon the context, the symbol, the act, plays out differently. So something like a kiss will have different meanings based upon the context, or convey a different message based upon the context. A kiss between a soldier and his or her loved one returning home from war, right, conveys a particular message, as in opposition to, right, the kiss between a mother and her child, right? Symbolically, we've attached meaning to all the individuals involved in those examples, but also to the kiss. Right? And so that's just one example of how symbolic interactionists really look at our acts as symbols and then the meanings we attach to those things. If we were to visualize, again, just another example of how symbolic interactionism is visualized. So you can think about how in your day-to-day life, what kind of messages are conveyed, what kind of symbols are offered in these various scenarios, right? What message is conveyed when you see a father tuck his child into bed? What messages are received when perhaps you see a husband and wife talk, right? Depending on the nature of the conversation, their tone with one another, their proximity to one another, we read into and can learn much about, right, those two individuals. What can you learn about a neighborhood based on how neighbors interact? When they walk outside to go to work in the morning, Are there a lot of greetings? Hey, how are you? How's it going? Didn't see you at the block party or what have you. Or does everyone go into their garage, get into their cars, and drive off with little interaction? That again can convey a message and offer us some insight into that neighborhood and the culture of that neighborhood, if you will. And yes, it's that time again. Let's apply symbolic interactionism to divorce and marriage and see how a symbolic interactionist will answer a very similar question. So, what if our question was, what has changed about divorce? Again, if a symbolic interactionist is interested in the meaning, right, the meanings that we attach to things and concepts, that's what we're going to look at. So if we're looking at the question again, what has changed about divorce? We might have to first think about, well, has the meaning of marriage changed over time? What about the meaning of divorce? Decades ago, divorce was met. Women and men who divorced were stigmatized, were judged. Various religious faiths were far more restrictive as to who could and could not become divorced. So meanings of divorce have changed. What about the meaning of parenthood? Again, not so long ago, many individuals believed in order to be an effective parent or provide a solid household for one's children, the two units needed to stay together. However, as more and more American families take on various compositions, the meaning of parenthood has changed. And no longer, or there's fewer people who believe in the fact that in order to be effective parents, you must reside in the same household. Right? As divorce rates increase, we're starting to see far more examples of quality co-parenting, if you will, even when the parents are no longer together. And then finally, the idea or the meaning of love. Right? In some instances, there may have been the belief that there's only one true love or one soulmate, or the idea that marriage is forever. And for some, this idea has changed. And so all of these, right, the meanings of each one of these, marriage, divorce, parenthood, and love, from a symbolic interactionist perspective, could influence or could help us to understand what has changed about our ideas about divorce that may have then influenced increasing divorce rates. So hopefully you've been able to see the ways that we can use theory to help us explain and oftentimes predict human social behavior. Right? Theories don't offer any absolute truths, but they do provide in many ways a guideline or a way to, again, explain and predict human social behavior. This chart is from chapter 2 in your textbook, and I think it's very useful in helping to make sense of the three theories and what they have to offer and how they can help us understand our various questions about human behavior. I would encourage you to keep this particular chart as a reference as we move throughout the textbook. It will prove useful as we continue to build on our understanding of each one of these three theories.